My name is Saval Knick. I'm the elementary band director at Mattapique Elementary School. And I have played a little bit of oboe, but not a lot. I play all the band instruments, so that's one of them that I studied. An oboe is a woodwind instrument, just like a clarinet or a flute. Those are all woodwinds and saxophone. The oboe brings a really unique color to the orchestra. In the orchestra, you have the string section that's like, can be a very mellow sound, but over all the strings you have a very, consistent sound. And all the woodwinds and brass instruments that are added to orchestras are really there to give a completely different color to the sound. And the oboe is the only one like it. It's very unique, and it's the only one with just that kind of sound. Sometimes plays the melody, sometimes has solos or interjection parts. Not a lot of people play oboe, especially it's one of the hardest instruments to play, so kids are rarely started on it because it's expensive and the reeds are expensive, and it's just very difficult to sound good. To sound good, you have to have a really good reed, a really good sense of intonation, and just be a really, really great musician. So it's often hard to find those people and to get them to switch instruments later in life. So a good oboe player is very hard to come by. The difference between the reeds is that a clarinet or like a saxophone reed is a single reed. So this is a clarinet reed, there's only one part to it. Now an oboe reed is two. It's got one on this side and then one on this side, and there's a little hole that you kind of blow through. So it's a reed on both sides, whereas a clarinet reed you attach to a mouthpiece. So it'd be plastic or rubber on one side and the reed on the other. The oboe has two different reeds. The most appealing thing about the oboe is how unique it is. It just has that sound that no other instrument has, and it's a really big challenge. So if you're a musician who's really good at your instrument and you think you want more of a challenge, that's kind of the appeal. Is it's really difficult, and if you're somebody that's looking for that, then that's a really great choice for you.
Well, hello. Today we are going to learn about reed making and how oboists make their lovely reeds that they play to create a good sound quality and all that fun stuff. So that way they don't squeak or sound really ducky or all that fun stuff. So an oboe reed starts off in a very tube shape. This is called cane. A lot of the cane I purchase comes from China, but other oboists sometimes get cane from France area. So when it comes in, normally what we have to do is measure the best semicircular shape and cut it in half with a razor blade right down the middle. And then you get this kind of semicircular shape. Now this particular piece has already been shaved down a little bit. You can see that it's kind of thin in comparison to the cane that's thick on the inside of the tube. But we have this really expensive machine called a gouger. We put it in, it has like a fine razor blade, and we roll it over to make it thinner and thinner. And then the next process is to shape it into the nice triangular sort of shaped reed. So we have this thing called a shaper tip, and they make various kinds with thicknesses or whether it's more narrow, and some oboists play around and try and figure out which one might get the best sound quality. But what we do is we take a piece like this. We have to soak it in water because wood is more able to bend. The cane's able to shape and flex much easier unless it's dry. If it's dry, you're actually going to crack the cane quite quickly. So what we do is we put it on here, and then this is called an easel. It helps gauge the very center point of the cane. And then I would just put like a little increased dent right down the center. So that way, when it's done, I'll bend it in half, and then once it's bent in half, I'll put it over this shaper tip, and then take my razor blade, my fine razor blade, and shape it into this shape. And then the final product with that looks like this, and it's already bent and ready to go and to form into the reed. And then when we have that going, what I'll do is I take my little C-clamp, and I have to prepare tying it on to what we call the staple, because the entire reed needs to be sewn together. So I'll tie one of my favorite colors, like lime green, or you can come across thread that's multicolor, and we usually invest in double F, the type of thickness of the thread, so that way it doesn't break. Normally if it starts with like the letter A, B, C, A would be like really thin thread, and that would pop really easily. So we would just tie it on to the C-clamp. If I can get it in there. And then once I tie it maybe roughly 3 times through, I'm just gonna turn this back this direction. There we are. Once we tie it on there, then we're kind of ready to go ahead and put the cane on the staple. Now, because the staple is so tiny, it's really hard to hold in your hand when you're tying the whole thing together. So we have here a mandrel, as we call it, and the mandrel helps hold the staple, so it's easier to grasp and hold on there. So then we would just tie it on here. Now this is all measured and calculated. The best calculation I use is at 72 millimeters, so I'm measuring from the bottom of the staple up to the tip of the cane. So I usually look exactly for 72, or a rough estimate, which I did automatically, because if you do this forever and ever, then you kind of know how long it is. And then when I go to tie it, when you look at the side, you can see where the staple starts. You can see where the staple starts. You want to actually start a little bit below where the tip of the staple is, and tie upward before starting to tie backwards. It kind of helps give it a nice, it closes it off nicely at the edges. So I'm going to behave as if I'm going to tie this reed. And then when you're tying the sides, you tie upward first. Now this piece is dry, you're going to notice you can see right through to the staple. If it was soaked in water for roughly 20 minutes, since that expands the cane itself, it'll seal up the sides and make it pretty easy. But if I were to really tug and pull like I normally do, I would crack this piece. But for the purposes now, just showing like a light estimate, that I go up first, and then I kind of wrap back over, so I do like sort of a crisscross before tying backwards on the reed. And then it would go all the way down, and then I would just tie like a knot at the bottom. And let me see, I may have, in this case, no, well, you can see this is a broken one. This is definitely not usable anymore. But you can see once it's all tied off on there, and you can even see on the sides how it needs to have like a nice seal, not it's see-through. And if you can imagine though, the tip of the cane still has not been chopped or clipped, so that way there's no hole. So imagine this is still closed off. And typically for me, I do a several day process. So once I've done that, I kind of set it off to the side and come back to it the next day. Because wood does continuously change with the weather and the humidity and the dryness, I want the wood to kind of set. I want the cane to set in wherever it would normally be the next day or days to come. So that way it's not consistently changing. Because if I were to do the whole process in one day, the next day my cane, everything would go berserk. Like it wouldn't have the same sound quality at all. It might look the same, but it definitely doesn't feel the same. So imagine this is still closed off. Then we clamped it on top. And then what I need to do, rather than chopping it right away because it's still really thick, I would go ahead and take my knife and just trim lightly above towards the tip. And this is also measured too. I normally start the trimming around 65 millimeters from the bottom of the staple, so I count from 65 to the tip. And I normally take like a pencil and find, okay, 65 was measured at this certain place. So then I would start shaving off the tip, getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And then once I feel it's at its thinnest point before cracking or opening up, that is when, we're at one little piece. I think I may actually have it in my bag. So the next process is taking this little block. It's just a wooden block and it has a little bit of rubber on the bottom, so that way when you put it down it doesn't really go anywhere, it adds a little friction. But when we're about to chop the reed, I can demonstrate with this since this is one of my broken ones. But I would take one of the razor blades. You can possibly use the same one, but it dulls pretty easily. But I would just kind of hold it right on the chopping block, and I kind of chop at a little bit of an angle. It's just been proven through research for the best sound quality to have one side of the cane a little shorter than the other. So I just kind of hold the reed a little bit at an angle and chop off the very tip. And then I'll remeasure it again to make sure that I haven't chopped off too much. Usually I chop it down to 70 millimeters, so before the length of it was 72, so I'll chop it down to 70 millimeters and start from there. And then the rest of the process really is all by eyesight and based upon what you think makes the best sound quality reed. Essentially there are 3 sections to the reed. It might be hard to see in this lighting, but I'll show you a little bit of an example here. So this is a finished reed, and typically there are 3 sections. The very bottom, what we call the back windows, and then we have the middle section, which is the heart, and then the very tip. So the tip, heart, and then back windows. The tip is the thinnest, so from your camera sight you can probably see that it's very light looking, it's not as dark, right? And as it gets darker, that's where the cane is thickest. The heart should be the thickest. And then the very back windows are kind of an in-between, not quite as thin as the tip, but not as thick as the heart. And typically, when you have a really thin tip, that's where vibrations can occur the most. Kind of like if you ever have taken a piece of grass from outside and blown to make that buzzing sound. The grass blade is really, really thin. But then if you were to take like a piece of, like a stick, you know, that's something really thick, you wouldn't be able to make that sound quality because it's not as able to vibrate, since sound is created by vibrations. And then the heart we like having, because if the heart did not exist, you would get a really thin, kind of nasally sound quality. So we want to keep a thicker heart. It's just been proven that it does create like a nice richness to it. And then the back windows are sort of like the icing on the cake. Like, you don't need the icing, but it's nice to have it because it adds a little sweetness. So it adds like a nice little extra, you know, touch. So which is pretty cool. And this whole process, I mean, I would really get to almost a finished product on my second day, shaving it down little by little. And I normally kind of count it out a little bit, like do a couple on this side, a couple on this side. But you don't want to do an exact finish the second day because your reed is still morphing into its shape and stability. So by the third day, that's where I'll try it out and just do any sort of extra finishing touches. So essentially that's pretty much it when it comes to reed making. You know, a 3-day process brought down within 10 minutes.